I wanted to make a few of these, so I'm glad enough of you liked them and encouraged me to make others. I am really flattered by that. Thank you all for watching my previous video, and thank you for deciding to tune in again and watch this one. I'm doing this before I record the main bit of the essay. I should probably do it afterwards because then I'll know how long it is. But this unit, this is Theories of Crime Causation for Criminology. This one's quite a long one. I think it's up there with, yeah, it's definitely in the top 3 of the longest essays that I wrote. So this one might be a bit longer than the other one. Anyway, yeah. I have to mention that I consider both left-wing and right-wing viewpoints in this video because we had to consider both sides. So don't take my inclusion of James Q. Wilson or Jog Young or anyone like that. Don't take their inclusion in this essay as an endorsement. They're in there because they have to be, because they're important to the subject, they're relevant, they propose things. I don't agree necessarily with everything I write about. Don't whinge in my comments. You can do that elsewhere. Tweet me. If you want to whinge about it, tweet me. Yeah, here's my Twitter account. Unless you're one of my parents, in which case don't. Because you don't want to see my Twitter account, please don't. Anyway, yes. Throughout the history of criminology, many different aspects of criminal behaviour have been considered in the search for an explanation of crime, but even before Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham struck the first sparks of criminological thought, moral character was often the first place people looked when asking the question, why did this person commit this crime? Up until the Industrial Revolution, crime was seen as a symptom of personal depravity, an unscrupulous failing on the part of the individual, so questions of morality have always been intimately associated with theories of crime causation, though in a rather individual and abstract sense, as opposed to anything grounded in science or rationality. Such grounding is a relatively recent development, though so is criminology as a whole, and while early criminologists veered away from morals and ethics in favour of purely physical evidence and explanations, recently, moral aspects have begun to be considered in a criminological view once again. Bernard and Joshua Gert define morality as the most important code of conduct put forward and accepted by any group or even an individual, though they do also point out that the behaviours within that code of conduct can vary wildly. Morality is relative, and consequently behaviours prohibited in one society may be promoted or even exalted in another. Nonetheless, morality as a possible indicator of criminal behaviour has become a key component of several criminological theories in recent decades, notably in the work of right realist theories such as James Q. Wilson and Charles Murray. While other perspectives may argue about the extent to which the law and morality should intertwine, right realists concern themselves less with challenging the law itself and more with the conditions responsible for criminal behaviour at a basic street crime level. Accepting behaviourist principles of conditioning, Wilson and his Daily Mail reading friends look to the family to explain criminality in both a psychological and biological sense. Genetics will determine criminal potential, poor socialisation will help realise it, and ultimately the law will serve as an ineffective deterrent in the face of these more powerful behavioural influences. It follows thus that crime is an individual choice. An individual chooses to ignore the law and follow their friends, and most of the focus of law enforcement should be on precursor behaviours, drunken disorderly behaviour, vandalism, loitering in gangs, and so on and so forth, that may harm the community as a whole, instead of on trying to rehabilitate individuals already socialised into criminal life. For those, right realists prescribe punitive periods in prison as pragmatic panacea, a distortion of Beccarian beliefs in the severity and definitive nature of justice in order to dissuade others from taking up the criminal mantle. Right realism had arisen as a response to the permissiveness and free love the rise of counterculture in the 1960s had embraced, and such is the cyclical nature of things. Left realism soon arose as a counter to the harsh individuality of the right realists. Taking inspiration from Marxist theories on conflict, left realists such as Stuart Hall proposed that crime was an inherently political act, a conscious reaction to the inequalities of the capitalist system. Further, both the police's responses to crimes and the media's reporting of them served as tools to deflect attention away from the cause and onto the individual, a topic which was the focus of both Hall's Policing the Crisis and Stanley Cohen's Folk Devils and Moral Panics, which looked at the media's reporting of muggings and conflicts between youth groups, mods and rockers, respectively. For left realists, street crime could be explained by frustrations resulting from economic exploitation. Addiction, poverty and near starvation are the forces which drive people to mug and to steal, whereas to right realists, all those poor people simply need to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get a job. Crime is an individual decision, right realists argue, and that certain people are more likely to resort to crime instead of earning a legitimate wage, to which left realists respond by highlighting how many of those people are from economically deprived areas, and how it's funny that we don't do as much to rein in white-collar crime such as holding economy-crashing bankers accountable. Though both broadly agree that the offender should be held to account, to what extent the offender is culpable is the fiercest point of disagreement, especially when it comes to how much responsibility the rest of society should bear for the crime committed. Later, left realists such as Jock Young began to move away from the Marxist ideas and instead emphasised the idea of moral responsibility, seeing crime as an essentially selfish act, albeit still one born of desperation under a capitalist system. Whereas morality drifts in and out of fashion as criminologists search for possible criminal origins, a fierce topic that is always on vogue in criminological circles is the psychology of offenders and how contributory that may be. Like siblings stealing each other's toys, criminologists have always been keen to apply psychological developments to criminals, who are irresistible cases and test subjects for psychologists. Consequently, essentially every psychological perspective has provided a view on criminality, though evaluating all is obviously beyond the scope of this essay, so only 4 will be considered. Psychodynamic theory will be discussed first, because it's basically the law that Freud gets name-checked whenever psychology is mentioned. Yeah, no, he's one of the big ones. Freud himself wrote little about crime or criminals, possibly because his clientele were rich middle-class Austrians, but psychodynamic theories of crime have been developed based on his writings about the development of the id, ego, and superego throughout childhood. Freud believed that children were basically little gits who were ruled by their selfish, innate desires, control of which they gradually learn as they grow and are socialized. However, disruptions to the development of the ego and the superego can lead to criminal behaviors in later life, which psychoanalysts interpret as manifestations of inadequate control over the id. One such psychoanalyst was John Bowlby, who proposed that a period of prolonged separation from the child's primary caregiver, typically the mother, during the first few years of childhood could result in severe emotional trauma and later lead to affectionless psychopathy. However, one particularly poignant criticism of Bowlby's infamous 44 Thieves studies is that the children that made up his sample came from deprived backgrounds, often orphanages, and thus it is questionable whether his theory can be generalised across all children. Further psychoanalytic theories came from the work of Jean Piaget, who studied the development of reasoning through childhood. Piaget proposed that there are 3 stages of cognitive growth. Where action precedes thought in the first few years of childhood, by the onset of adolescence, this sequence of events is reversed, with most children able to mentally consider decisions before acting. His work on how children learn serves as an important link between the legacy of Freud and the distinctly more scientific field of behaviourism, notably via Albert Bandura. Known mainly for his pioneering work with children and the nightmarishly clown-patterned Bobo dolls, Bandura theorised that children learn behaviours by imitating observed behaviours in others, with intimate groups such as family and friends having notably significant influence on which behaviours children end up imitating. This has obvious criminological applications. If an individual's social group is dominated by delinquent or criminal behaviour, that individual is more likely to engage in similar behaviour. Further support for this was found by Donald J. West and David P. Farrington. In their large-scale study of over 400 working-class boys between the ages of 8 and 19, they isolated several factors associated with delinquency, chief amongst which was having a parent with a criminal record. The personality theory of Hans Eysenck linked classical conditioning and evolutionary science. First proposed in 1967, Eysenck reasoned that the development of the autonomic nervous system, the biological mechanism which regulates our levels of arousal and our responses to stimuli, has a profound influence on how easily an individual is conditioned to social rules. This is the ultimate determinant of who will go on to engage in criminal behaviour, as those with an underactive autonomic nervous system are harder to stimulate and thus have to indulge in riskier and more extreme behaviour.
All in the game, yo.
Multifaceted, Eysenck's personality theory employs biological and behaviourist views, accepting the implicit biological predestination, but also allowing for humans as rational actors, acknowledging that individuals can choose crime following a maximum pleasure, minimum pain assessment. It places people on a personality spectrum along 3 dimensions, extroversion, neuroticism and psychoticism, using a test developed by Eysenck to determine an individual's placement and thus their assumed ease of social conditioning. A wider scope enables Eysenck's personality theory to account for external influences, and thus it also serves as a bridge to allowing sociological theories of crime causation to be considered. The idea that criminals were a separate social class really took hold during the Victorian era, when writers such as Jack London and Henry Mayhew spent time amongst the poverty-stricken, crime-ridden slums of London and wrote about their experiences amongst the deprived working class. Misconceptions about Darwin's theory of evolution fueled beliefs about criminals being lower forms of humanity, with these Lombrosian attitudes still persisting in one form or another well into the 21st century. To highlight this, Giddens and Sutton used the example of Christopher Jeffries, the landlord of murder victim Joanna Yates, who between 2010 and 2011 was judged by the British press to be the perpetrator on account of his strange and oddball appearance. Jeffries was innocent and later sued and won significant libel damages from 8 newspapers, with his case serving as a stark reminder that the belief that criminals must be physically distinct from law-abiding individuals still holds significant cultural power, even if it's no longer considered academically or scientifically valid. Contemporaneous to Lombroso's attitude towards men I'm doing this once. Contemporaneous to Lombroso's attitudes towards criminal men were Emile Durkheim's thoughts on society and social order. Rather than seeing criminals as lesser evolved humans, Durkheim saw crime itself as one of the many necessary facets of a functioning society. A measure of crime and deviance were needed, he argued, as they were manifestations of the collective norms and values of society. All societies have some prescribed behaviours, which represent the collective values of those societies, and our reactions to crime are expressive and public because the criminal has not only harmed the individual, but transgressed the beliefs of society as a whole, with the punishment, frequently exclusion in one form or another, understood as the collective disapproval of all. But those values were rarely consistent across societies or centuries, and Durkheim realised that periods of rapid social upheaval which resulted in traditional norms disappearing could have damaging effects on the stability of that society. He named this phenomena anomie, from the Greek anomos, literally without law, and it would later come to form a central concept of his writings, the division of labour in society, and suicide. His discussion of morality and culture ensured they remained relevant as concepts and helped move criminology away from purely physiological causes. Following humanity's brief break in the early 20th century to slaughter each other by the millions, society and culture became the focus of a group of scholars in America. As industry flourished in the city of Chicago throughout the 1920s, it attracted a wide variety of ethnic groups from both around the USA and the world. Multiple nationalities and multiple ethnicities converging in a single location provided a unique opportunity for sociologists, and what became known as the Chicago School, located in the first sociology department opened in the USA, soon began producing influential works about urban living and race relations. Robert E. Park led the charge, proposing that differences between ethnic groups are the causes of conflicts when these groups are brought together, and a period of interracial adjustment, where conflict and competition for resources and land were gradually eliminated by assimilation and accommodation, would inevitably follow. Through this process of competition, concentrations of communities would be clustered in particular areas, which Ernest Burgess proposed was not a random dispersal, but could be understood sociologically, dividing up the pattern of dispersal into outwardly radiating concentric circles. Within the centre, what Burgess termed Zone 1, were clustered the main industrial and economic industries, leaving little room for residential areas and forcing workers to commute. Wealth dictated how far an individual could move from the first zone, and so workers, along with the poor and the transient, tended to be grouped together tightly in the deprived areas nearby, with the more affluent able to move further away into nicer countryside surroundings. For criminologists, the second zone, the zone of transition, was of particular interest, as it was here that poverty, crime and deviance occurred at disproportionately high levels. This was expanded on by fellow Chicago scholars Clifford R. Shaw and Henry D. McKay, who believed that the frequent turnover of residents in the second zone created an almost anomic area where the usual social inhibitions which held back criminality were weak. Originally termed social disorganization, this would later be revised and become known as cultural transmission. Since crime was prolific in this zone, criminal behaviours became normalized, and those values were passed down through generations, with successful criminals providing both role models for impressionable youngsters and evidence that crime would ultimately pay. Oh, I'm going to use so much footage of The Wire during this bit.
Oh, indeed.
This idea found support in the work of Robert Merton, who had proposed that the American ideals of wealth and prosperity often clashed with people's lived economic situations, which placed great pressure on those who could not make material progress. Believing there were several possible responses to this strain, Merton reasoned that having found legitimate means unavailable to them, some people innovated by turning to illegitimate and thus illegal methods to make money. Further work on subcultures came from Albert K. Cohen, who wrote of delinquent subculture, which he believed stemmed from feelings of status frustration, disenchantment and disenfranchisement felt by those who failed to achieve economic success via traditional social norms and methods. Thus, working-class youth, feeling no status in academic or economic circles, find stature and belonging in the subcultures of gangs and delinquency, thus propagating those subcultural ideals further. Subcultural theories were developed throughout the 70s and 80s by British criminologists, spurned on by Stanley Cohen's Folk Devils and Moral Panics in 1972 and The New Criminology by Taylor, Walton and Young in 1973. British criminologists took subcultural theories and infused them with a uniquely British mix of concepts and ideas, such as labelling theory, where subcultures define themselves by the labels traditional authorities, such as the police and the media, apply to them, as well as class considerations, such as the effect of urban redevelopment on working class subcultures, as studied by a third Cohen, Philip, in 1972's Subcultural Conflict and Working Class Community, and a modern interpretation of Marxist conflict theories, which held that the focus on the crimes of the poor was disproportionate and that the crimes of the rich deserved more attention. Marx had written little about crime, so interpretations varied, but the earliest attempt had been by Dutch professor Willem Bonge in 1916, who introduced ideas that the left realist explored. Bonge proposed that capitalism stimulated economic desires at every level of society, increasing the lust for material goods amongst the rich and poor alike, and leading inevitably to crime. Though initially rejected as idealistic by left realists during the 1970s, Bonge's ideas were later reconsidered as the left realists of the 90s began to reassess the relationship between crime and contemporary economic forces. One of the most fundamental aspects to any criminological theory is its approach to violence, which can be broadly defined as any form of behaviour by an individual that intentionally threatens or does cause physical, sexual or psychological harm to others or to him or herself, though both definitions of and institutional responses to violence are frequently contested by various groups, as any definition must necessarily cover a wide variety of behaviours. Violent crimes differ in levels and type of violence. For example, pub brawls and abusive relationships involve different dynamics of violence in level, physicality and origin. In the search for explanations of violence, criminologists frequently borrow from psychological fields, though the natural sciences have also fielded several potential theories, with one of the most influential being the early work of Conrad Lorenz. Founder of the field of ethology, the study of animals, Lorenz proposed that aggression was an evolutionary instinct, present in all animals and essential to the survival of a species, serving a purpose when resources are scarce and territory must be defended. Freud wrote of Thanatos, the death instinct, an unconscious desire which seeks self-destruction and is externalized as aggression. However, like most psychoanalytical theories, it's hard to find scientific support for its claims, and its relevance has varied as newer theories regarding the psychology and biology of aggression have been proposed. Isaac's thoughts on the autonomic nervous system and its development offer firmer grounding, with Isaac highlighting that individuals with extroverted personalities that are shaped by biological and social influences are impulsively driven to behaviours that excite them, regardless of the legality or outcome. Where Isaac's theory stumbles is that there are many different types of violent behaviour. Not every psychopath is violent, and not every violent criminal is a psychopath, but crucially, it does indicate a biological origin for violent behaviour. American paediatrician Eli Neuberger points to testosterone as a significant influence on the behaviour of young boys, though quickly adds that testosterone alone does not mandate violence, and that there is an aspect of learned behaviour in violence that can't be explained away as biological reflex. Neuberger's description of the effects of testosterone echo Freud's ruminations on the death instinct and catharsis. Boys typically engage in activities which build up and then release physical tensions, whilst also supporting the classical conditioning principles accepted by Isaac and others. Classical conditioning is an integral concept, as socio-cultural forces may be significant factors in realising crime, especially among young working-class boys and men. Typically underachieving at school, hormonal teenage boys desperately searching for some sense of masculine identity frequently build that identity around physical aggression, often acting out after the bell is rung. However, this is not true of all boys of all social classes, as conditioning environments vary wildly, and consequently not every individual male will express their masculine identity identically. Social class itself may play a part, as it is typically working class subcultures which are portrayed as violent, and there may be several contributing sociological factors behind this stereotype. Frequently, lower self-esteem stemming from unemployment in deprived areas and increased strain on interpersonal relationships can cause working class men to lash out, expressions of violence being one of the few avenues available to them to assert their masculine identities. Ethnicity may also be a factor, with young males from many minorities feeling frustrated by systemic discrimination or believing that legitimate career opportunities are being withheld, further contributing to feelings of aggression. Ethnic stereotypes propagate rapidly, which can influence attitudes towards minorities and alter interactions with them. Stereotypes abound as violence and crime are frequently linked, and yet the reality is that according to the Crime Survey of England and Wales, overall, violent crimes are not increasing. Incidence rates of violent crime in 2017 were down 44% compared to 2007, a decline that has been constant, if not consistent, since 1995, along with other types of crime, such as theft, similarly falling. Further, crime is increasingly uncommon. Some 8 out of 10 people surveyed by the Crime Survey of England and Wales were not victims of any crimes. So why such a disconnect? One answer may be cultural. The media has a powerful grip on our ability to perceive reality, and it can grossly distort our perceptions of the world around us. Overly sensationalized images stay in the mind longer than more realistic and mundane depictions of society, and this effect is cumulative, resulting in irrational beliefs about crime rates, potential safety risks, and so on. Unfortunately, this also has the side effect of propagating negative stereotypes and incorrect beliefs, which can have consequences for both criminals and victims alike.
All right, Kev.
Stereotypes are the consequence of our tendency to group people together around a specific characteristic, a mental habit which has its criminological roots in the work of Lombroso, who attempted to discern criminal potential in the physical features of individuals and sort them by type. His work was later refined by William Sheldon, who narrowed down body types to 3 distinct builds: chubby endomorphs, scrawny ectomorphs, and buff mesomorphs, in a search for a criminal body shape. These early efforts to define criminals by distinct typological groupings have contemporary equivalents in the personality quizzes of psychologists such as Ising and Robert Hare, which suggest biological determinism is still a powerful concept in criminological circles, despite our understanding of diet and exercise largely disproving Sheldon's theory. However, the characteristics assigned to each typology have the potential to influence the perceived traits of that group and reinforce negative portrayals, a tendency which becomes more pronounced amongst racial lines. Combined with media amplification, stereotypes still have the power to alter the preconceptions we have about different groups of people, a power that is arguably stronger in a social media landscape. Various hate crime laws exist to attempt to mitigate the effects of such harmful beliefs. Ray explains that the media stirs up resentment of migrant populations by preying on people's anxieties, such as jobs, housing and healthcare, which not only turns those marginalised communities into scapegoats, but also reinforces social power hierarchies. If one were so inclined, one could interpret this as white male society lashing out in fear, as white men are wont to do. If one was so inclined. Yeah, that'll do. If one were so inclined. All the subtlety of a sledgehammer to the face. So yeah, that was my criminology essay for Unit 3. That was Theories of Crime Causation. Thank you for watching. If you made it this far, I do appreciate you sticking with me, and I appreciate the fact that you've taken time out of your busy lives, the one life you have on this planet, and you've chosen to spend 20 minutes watching one of my videos. Thank you. Thanks to everybody who watched the last one and gave me advice and encouragement and constructive criticism as well. I do really appreciate that. My sources, my in-text references are on the screen now. My video ones will be in the description below. They both don't fit at the same time, so I have to split the two. I'd also like to apologise for anyone who was expecting more visual aids than just clips of The Wire. I do like to use a wide variety of sources to help illustrate whatever I'm talking about, but there's just so many themes in The Wire that are appropriate for what I was talking about that I just kept going back to it for different clips. And also, it's one of my favourite shows ever, so I'm going to use clips of it if I can. I'd like to give a big shout out to my tutor because I forgot to in the last essay, and also while I was editing this one, we got our final grades and all our work back, and he wrote some very touching things in his last feedback form for me. And yeah, thank you, Adam. You're a brilliant tutor, and I'm going to miss you. So yeah, thank you all for watching. I'm thinking about doing another one, probably going to be psychology again, because I did write an essay on hoarding and I thought it was quite good and that might make a good video. Might do a sociology one at some point, but they're a bit more British centric, and if you're not British it can be quite boring, and plus the criminology and psychology ones are a bit more interesting. I mean, that's why I'm going into forensic psychology. Anyway, yeah, thank you all for watching. Hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye.